You ever feel like trying to get a handle on Congress is like trying to find your way through a maze where the walls keep moving?
Oh, definitely.
You hear the news, the debates, the endless flow of information, and it can all feel incredibly overwhelming.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Well, today we're grabbing a map and shining a light on that maze.
Exactly. This deep dive is all about the U.S. Congress, its very foundation, how it operates day in and day out, and, the complex way representation actually works within this core institution of American democracy.
And we're not just offering opinions here. We've got some really insightful excerpts from a chapter that dives deep into all of this.
Right.
Think of this as your shortcut, the key insights distilled down so you can really understand what's going on Capitol Hill.
hmm
Our mission is to bring clarity to the structure and powers of Congress, how its members are chosen, and the real nuances of who they represent. We want to equip you to understand the bigger picture without needing to read a stack of books. So with that in mind, where do we even begin to make sense of this powerful branch of government?
Well, the chapter rightly begins by looking at the fundamental design of Congress.
Yeah.
And it stresses a point that's easy to overlook.
Uh-huh.
The people who framed the Constitution really intended Congress to be the central authority in the Republic.
Right. Not the presidency.
Exactly. This wasn't a secondary consideration. It was a very deliberate choice, driven by their experiences.
Absolutely. Coming out from under a monarchy, the last thing they wanted was another single, all-powerful figure calling the shots.
Makes sense.
So Article 1 of the Constitution lays out some really significant initial powers for Congress, doesn't it? Things like having control over the nation's finances, making the laws of the land, confirming important appointments, and even deciding when to go to war.
Yeah, that's a pretty substantial set of responsibilities.
It is.
And the chapter emphasizes that the drive to create this new structure wasn't just theoretical. It grew out of the very real shortcomings of the Articles of Confederation.
Right. The first attempt didn't quite cut it.
Not really. The country was facing serious challenges, states were in conflict over trade, and events like Shays' Rebellion really highlighted how ineffective the central government was at maintaining order.
Yes, Shays' Rebellion. Just as a quick reminder for everyone, that was a group of Revolutionary War veterans in Massachusetts who were pretty fed up with the economic situation and the threat of losing their farms, and they actually took up arms in protest.
Yeah, definitely not a sign of a stable new nation.
No.
Precisely. It really underscored the urgent need for a stronger national framework, which directly led to the Constitutional Convention. And that's where the big debates about the structure of this new legislature started, most notably the fundamental question of representation.
Cue the face-off between the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan.
The big ones.
If I'm remembering correctly, Virginia proposed a bicameral legislature that's two chambers with representation in both based on a state's population.
Correct.
So the more people a state had, the more say they'd get.
Exactly. From their perspective, it made sense, given their larger populations. But the smaller states naturally worried that this would leave them without a meaningful voice.
Yeah, they get drowned out.
So they proposed the New Jersey plan, which called for a unicameral legislature, just one chamber, with every state getting an equal number of representatives.
Talk about a recipe for deadlock. So how did they manage to break that impasse? That's where the Great Compromise, also known as the Connecticut Compromise, comes in.
The absolute cornerstone of our current congressional setup, it established a bicameral Congress, both a House of Representatives and a Senate.
Two chambers.
Right. The Senate would have equal representation with two senators from each state, which satisfied the concerns of the smaller states.
Okay.
And the House of Representatives would have representation based on the population of each state, which addressed the demands of the larger states.
So a mix.
This compromise, while seemingly practical, baked in a fundamental tension between population and state sovereignty that continues to shape American politics today.
A classic example of everyone having to give a little to get something. And this bicameral structure wasn't just a way to keep both big and small states happy. There was a real rationale behind having two separate chambers, wasn't there?
Absolutely. The framers envisioned it as a way to ensure more careful and thorough deliberation to prevent impulsive or poorly considered laws from being enacted.
A cooling saucer, almost.
You could say that. The requirement that identical bills must pass both the House and the Senate creates a built-in system of checks and balances within the legislative branch itself. It's designed to make the process of passing laws a deliberate and at times challenging one.
Which, watching Congress in action sometimes feels very accurate.
Yes.
So what does this two-chamber structure actually look like today in terms of numbers?
We currently have 100 senators, 2 from each of the 50 states, and they serve 6-year terms.
6 years. Quite a long time.
It is. In the House of Representatives, there are 435 members, and they serve 2-year terms.
Much short.
Much. The chapter also reminds us of the minimum age requirements to serve. You have to be at least 30 years old to be a senator and 25 to be a representative.
And those Senate seats, when the Constitution was first written, weren't even directly elected by the people, right?
That's correct. Originally, it was the state legislatures that chose the senators.
Interesting.
It took the 17th Amendment, ratified in 1913, to shift that to a popular vote by the people within each state.
Okay, so popular vote for senators now. Now, when we look at the House, the way those 435 seats are divided up among the states, the apportionment, that's another layer of complexity.
Oh, definitely.
Tell me about it. It's all based on population, and we have a census every 10 years to get those official counts. I remember reading about the equal proportions method. Sounds rather technical.
It is a specific mathematical formula that's used to allocate those House seats to the states based on the data from the census. And it's important to remember that every state is guaranteed at least one seat in the House, no matter how small its population.
Okay, at least one.
Right. It's also worth noting that the total number of House seats has been capped at 435 since 1929.
Kept at 435. And then after the census numbers come in, we have the always interesting process of redistricting.
Ah, yes.
That's where things can get, well, politically charged, shall we say.
Indeed. Every 10 years after those census figures are released, states have to redraw the boundaries of their congressional districts to try and ensure that each district has roughly the same number of voters.
Try being the operative word sometimes.
Yes. Of course, this process is where the highly controversial practice of gerrymandering comes into play.
Before we dive into that particularly thorny issue, the chapter does bring up some inherent challenges within the House itself, right? Like the sheer number of people each individual representative is supposed to, well, represent effectively.
That's a really significant point. The average population of a congressional district is now over 700,000 people per representative.
Wow, 700,000. That's a lot for one person.
It really is.
Yeah.
To put that into historical context, George Washington originally suggested around 30,000 constituents per member as a way to maintain truly effective representation.
Big difference.
Huge. The chapter also highlights a fundamental democratic issue. The residents of Washington, D.C., despite having a population of over 675,000, lack full voting representation in Congress. They only have a non-voting delegate.
That does seem like a pretty significant gap in democratic principles. Taxation without full representation, almost.
Yeah, you could certainly argue that.
Yeah.
Now let's circle back to reapportionment and redistricting. The chapter touches on some really difficult historical controversies surrounding this.
I imagine so.
It does indeed. Going all the way back to the Three-Fifths Compromise,
Yes.
where enslaved people, who of course couldn't vote, were counted as 3/5 of a person for the purpose of determining a state's representation in Congress.
Just a fundamentally awful compromise.
Absolutely. This was a deeply problematic and morally reprehensible part of our history that significantly impacted the early balance of political power.
And then, after the Civil War, even though formerly enslaved people were now counted as whole persons, many states, particularly in the South, implemented all sorts of measures to prevent them from actually exercising their right to vote.
Exactly. Things like poll taxes, literacy tests.
Right. So while their population numbers increased a state's representation, they weren't actually able to participate in the democratic process.
That's a crucial distinction. It wasn't until the Civil Rights Movement and the landmark passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that many of those discriminatory barriers began to be dismantled, paving the way for more equitable representation for African Americans.
A huge turning point.
Definitely. The chapter mentions the subsequent creation of majority-minority districts, which were intended to give black voters a greater chance of electing a candidate of their choice.
Which, in theory, sounds like a positive step towards fairer representation, but it also brings us right back to the complexities of gerrymandering, doesn't it?
It does.
Drawing these district lines specifically to create a majority for one particular group can easily be used to simply favor one political party over another.
You've hit on the central tension. Gerrymandering, the strategic manipulation of electoral district boundaries to favor a specific candidate or political party, is a practice that, while legal, raises serious ethical questions about fair representation.
Legal, but maybe not exactly fair.
That's the debate. It's a tactic used by both Democrats and Republicans when they have control of the state legislatures. The chapter provides a clear example in Texas, illustrating how district lines have been drawn in ways that appear designed to dilute the voting power in areas like Austin.
Cracking and packing.
Those are the techniques. The primary goal of gerrymandering is often to create safe seats for one party, making it incredibly difficult for the other party to compete effectively. It's like the politicians are picking their voters rather than the other way around.
It definitely makes you wonder just how truly representative some of these districts actually are. Okay, so we've looked at the basic structure, and we've touched on the rather complicated process of how members get elected. Now, what about what they actually do once they're in office? Let's delve into the powers of Congress.
Right. So now that we understand the structure, the big question is, what can Congress actually do?
Yeah, what are the tools in their toolbox?
The powers of Congress are generally divided into three main categories:
Mm-hmm.
enumerated powers, implied powers, and inherent powers. Enumerated powers are those specifically listed in the Constitution, primarily in Article 1, Section 8.
That's the really important section, right? It lists things like the power to levy taxes, to declare war, to raise and support armies, to coin money, to regulate commerce. It's a pretty comprehensive list.
It is, and the chapter specifically highlights the power of the purse, the ability to tax and appropriate funds, as arguably the most fundamental of these powers.
Control the money, control, well, a lot.
Exactly. And these enumerated powers also serve as crucial checks on the other branches of the federal government. Only Congress can introduce legislation.
Right. The starting point for laws.
The Senate has the power to confirm many key presidential appointments and treaties, and the House of Representatives holds the sole power to impeach federal officials, including the president.
The power of advice and consent, and the power of impeachment.
These are all vital elements of congressional oversight.
Okay, so those are the powers that are explicitly stated in the Constitution. What about implied powers? That's where the necessary and proper clause comes into play, right?
Precisely. The necessary and proper clause, often referred to as the elastic clause, gives Congress the authority to make laws that are necessary and proper for carrying out its enumerated powers.
Kind of a catch-all.
In a way, yes. It allows Congress to adapt. This clause is the constitutional basis for a vast amount of the legislation we see today. Laws regulating the banking system, establishing a minimum wage, and funding the construction of interstate highways are all examples.
So most modern laws probably fall under this.
In fact, the majority of the work Congress does today falls under these implied powers.
And then we have inherent powers. These aren't even written down in the Constitution, but it's understood that Congress possesses them simply because it's the legislative body of a sovereign nation.
That's the general understanding. These are powers considered essential for any functioning national government, such as controlling the nation's borders, expanding its territory, and defending itself against threats.
Things a country just has to be able to do.
Right. The argument is that these powers are so fundamental to the nature of government that they didn't need to be explicitly listed in the Constitution.
Now, the chapter spends a significant amount of time discussing the Commerce Clause. That seems like a particularly broad and important power in terms of the reach of Congress.
It is indeed. The Commerce Clause grants Congress the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations, among the various states, and with Native American tribes. Over time, the Supreme Court has generally interpreted this clause very broadly.
Very broadly.
Which has significantly expanded Congress's regulatory authority in areas that might seem to go beyond just trade between states, encompassing both interstate and even intrastate commerce.
So things happening within a state, too.
Under certain interpretations, yes. The evolving interpretation of the Commerce Clause demonstrates the Constitution's flexibility and the constant struggle to define the appropriate scope of federal power in a changing nation.
I remember reading that this broad interpretation of the Commerce Clause was really crucial for the passage of landmark legislation like civil rights laws and environmental protection regulations.
Exactly. Without that broad interpretation, much of that might not have been possible at the federal level. However, the chapter also points out that the Supreme Court's interpretation of this clause hasn't remained constant throughout history.
Okay, so it's shifted back and forth.
A bit. There was a period in the 1930s when the court adopted a narrower view of the Commerce Clause, and then in 1995, the United States v. Lopez case marked a significant moment where the court actually struck down a federal law based on the Commerce Clause for the first time in more than half a century.
Oh, Lopez, right, about guns in schools.
That's the one. This suggested a potential shift towards a more limited view of this expansive power.
And the legal challenges to the Affordable Care Act were interesting because the Supreme Court ultimately upheld the law based on Congress's power to tax rather than relying on the Commerce Clause,
Right. They sidestepped the Commerce Clause issue in that ruling.
leaving the exact scope of that power somewhat open to further debate.
That's right. It really highlighted the ongoing legal and political debate surrounding the limits of Congress's regulatory authority. Now, the chapter also delves into the historical power struggles that have existed between Congress and the other branches of the federal government, particularly the presidency.
The eternal tug of war. It mentions that in the early days of the Republic, Congress was definitely intended to be the dominant branch, but that the balance of power has shifted considerably over time, especially in the 20th century.
Indeed. The establishment of judicial review through the Supreme Court case Marbury v. Madison was an early assertion of power by the judicial branch.
The courts carving out their role.
But the presidency really began to accumulate more power, particularly during times of war, as we saw with Abraham Lincoln's actions during the Civil War.
Wartime expansion of executive power.
A recurring theme. And then the 20th century brought even more significant shifts, with the increasing need for federal regulation in a more complex economy, favoring the structure of the executive branch.
Because the executive can act more quickly sometimes.
Potentially, yes. And the president taking a much more prominent role in shaping foreign policy.
The Great Depression and the Second World War led to a substantial expansion of presidential power under Franklin D. Roosevelt.
FDR's presidency was transformative in that regard. Congress attempted to reassert some control with the passage of the 22nd Amendment, which limited presidents to 2 terms.
Trying to pump the brakes.
But the overall trend of increasing executive authority continued, especially during the Cold War, as President Truman's decision to send troops to Korea without a formal declaration of war illustrates.
Right, the police action.
It feels like in the aftermath of Vietnam and Watergate, there were attempts by Congress to reassert its authority, such as with the War Powers Resolution.
Did that really work, though?
Its effectiveness has been pretty limited, honestly. And the presidency still holds considerable sway, particularly in the post-9/11 era with the focus on the war on terror.
Yeah, that seemed to shift things again.
The chapter concludes this section by pointing to the ongoing tension, with presidents increasingly using executive orders and executive agreements, sometimes bypassing the need for congressional approval altogether.
Governing by decree, almost.
It further underscores the dynamic and often contested nature of the balance of power in our system of government. So, having explored the institutional design and powers of Congress, let's now turn our attention to how individuals actually get into Congress through congressional elections.
Yes, the electoral battleground. The chapter starts by outlining the basic constitutional requirements, age, and citizenship, which, as we noted earlier, are stricter for the Senate than for the House.
Right, 30 for Senate, 25 for House.
And, of course, there are the term lengths. 2 years for House members, 6 years for senators, and no term limits at the federal level, thanks to the Supreme Court's decision in U.S. Term Limits v. Thornton in 1995.
That's correct. And the way these elections are structured differs significantly between the 2 chambers. House members are elected by voters within specific congressional districts,
More local focus.
which can make them more directly responsive to local needs and concerns. Senators, on the other hand, are elected by the entire population of their state, which often requires a broader appeal.
Got one statewide.
Exactly. This fundamental difference, along with the shorter term length in the House, frequently contributes to a more structured leadership and sometimes a more partisan atmosphere compared to the Senate.
Yeah, the House can feel pretty intense. The chapter provides a good illustration of this dynamic with the example of the Buffett rule, which passed in the House but ultimately failed to gain the necessary support in the Senate.
Right, hit the Senate wall.
Highlighting the need for broader consensus in that chamber. And even with the Affordable Care Act, the more moderate version that originated in the Senate ultimately became law.
The Senate version prevailed.
Now, let's talk about a major factor in any election, perhaps especially in congressional races: campaign funding. It certainly sounds like the costs have increased dramatically over the years.
They have indeed. The chapter presents some rather striking figures comparing the average costs of House and Senate campaigns in 1986 to those in 2020,
I bet the difference is huge.
revealing a dramatic increase in both. It's no wonder that members of Congress often spend a significant portion of their time engaged in fundraising activities.
The money chase.
This reality raises important questions about who can afford to run, and whether the need to constantly raise money influences policy decisions.
It almost sounds like potential representatives have to dedicate themselves to fundraising just to have a chance to do the job itself.
It can feel that way.
Yeah.
And the chapter points out that the majority of direct campaign contributions actually come from individual donors rather than from political action committees or PACs.
Well, that's interesting. Individuals more than PACs.
For direct contributions, yes, which are organizations that raise money privately to influence elections or legislation, especially at the federal level. That's an interesting detail. But then we get into the long and complex history of campaign finance regulation in the U.S., which seems like a constant cycle of reforms and challenges.
Always trying to fix it, always finding loopholes.
It has been a dynamic and often contentious area, from early laws intended to limit corporate influence around World War I to the Federal Election Campaign Act in the 1970s that established the Federal Election Commission and introduced disclosure requirements and contribution limits,
Trying to bring transparency.
to the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, also known as McCain-Feingold, which aimed to restrict soft money in politics.
Soft money being the less regulated donations.
Right, money not given directly to candidates. There have been numerous attempts to regulate campaign finance. But then came the Citizens United v. FEC Supreme Court decision in 2010,
Ah, the big one.
which fundamentally altered the landscape by arguing that corporations and unions have a First Amendment right to spend unlimited amounts of money on political advertising independent of a candidate's campaign.
Free speech equals money, essentially.
That was the court's reasoning. This decision effectively ushered in the era of super PACs.
That Citizens United ruling seems to have really opened the floodgates for independent spending in elections, leading to the rise of these super PACs that can spend unlimited sums as long as they don't directly coordinate with the candidates themselves.
Right, the independent expenditure committees.
But there are still limits on how much individuals and PACs can directly contribute to candidates and political parties.
Yes, those direct contribution limits remain in place, though they are adjusted periodically for inflation. Now, a very significant factor in the dynamics of congressional elections is the power of incumbency.
Oh yeah, once you're in, it's hard to get you out. Those re-election rates for incumbents are consistently quite high in both the House and the Senate. They seem to have a pretty significant built-in advantage.
Several factors contribute to this so-called incumbency advantage. Incumbents typically have significant advantages in fundraising.
Donors like a winner.
They benefit from greater name recognition among voters, and they often operate within a party system where many districts are considered safe seats for one party or the other.
Thanks to gerrymandering sometimes.
Often, yes. Furthermore, incumbents can leverage their positions to engage in constituent casework, helping individuals and businesses navigate federal bureaucracy, which can be a powerful way to build local support.
Solving problems for folks back home.
Exactly. But the chapter does highlight that incumbents aren't always guaranteed victory, mentioning instances where they are challenged in primary elections, such as the notable defeat of Eric Cantor in 2014,
A huge upset.
showing that voter dissatisfaction can still lead to surprises. Now, shifting our focus slightly, how much do local issues versus broader national issues tend to drive these congressional elections? It feels like we're seeing an increasing nationalization of politics.
Yeah. Does all politics is local still hold true?
Well, the old saying, often attributed to former Speaker Tip O'Neill, still holds some truth, as voters are often motivated by issues directly affecting their communities. However, the surge and decline theory in political science suggests that in midterm elections, the president's party tends to lose seats due to lower turnout among less engaged voters who typically support the president in presidential election years.
And President's Party usually takes a hit midterm.
Usually, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But as the chapter points out, significant national issues such as the Iraq War and the 2006 and 2008 elections can definitely override these local factors and significantly influence congressional races.
National waves can swamp local concerns.
Exactly. And the trend does seem to be towards a greater nationalization of congressional elections, with an increase in straight ticket voting, where voters simply choose all candidates from one party.
Just checking the D or the R box all the way down.
Pretty much. And a decline in local issues dominating campaigns. The 2014 midterm elections are cited as a particularly nationalized election, and this trend has largely persisted.
So once these individuals are elected to Congress, who exactly are they supposed to be representing? It's clearly not as simple as just following the immediate demands of the majority in their district, is it?
Not at all. Representation is a really complex and multifaceted concept. It involves a constant balancing act between the needs and desires of their constituents, the demands of their political party, the influence of various interest groups, their own personal ideology and beliefs, and their understanding of the broader national interest.
A lot to juggle. The chapter outlines those classic models of representation: the delegate model, the trustee model, and the Politico model. Can you explain the key differences between these?
Certainly, in the delegate model, a representative sees their primary role as simply carrying out the direct wishes of their constituents.
Just be a mouthpiece.
Essentially, yes. They aim to understand what the majority of people in their district want and then vote accordingly, without necessarily exercising their own independent judgment. In contrast, a trustee model emphasizes the representative's responsibility to use their own informed judgment and expertise to make decisions on behalf of their constituents, even if those decisions don't perfectly align with every immediate public opinion.
Trust me, I know what's best. Edmund Burke stuff.
Precisely. The Politico model, which is perhaps the most realistic and common, involves representatives strategically blending these two approaches, depending on the specific issue at hand and the prevailing political context.
So switching hats depending on the situation.
Kind of. For example, on highly visible and emotionally charged issues, a representative might lean towards the delegate model, while on more complex or less salient issues, they might feel more comfortable acting as a trustee.
That makes a lot of sense. On really high-profile or controversial issues where their constituents feel strongly, they might be more inclined to act as a delegate.
Right, like maybe gun rights or abortion.
But on more technical or less visible policy matters, they might feel they have more leeway to act as a trustee based on their own knowledge and understanding.
Yeah, maybe complex economic reforms or something. Now, what about descriptive representation? That's about whether the people who are elected actually reflect the demographic makeup of the people they represent.
Right. Does Congress look like America?
Exactly. Descriptive representation focuses on whether the representatives share characteristics like race, ethnicity, gender, socioeconomic background, and sexual identity with their constituents. Historically, Congress has significantly lacked descriptive representation.
Mostly old white guys for a long time.
Yeah, having been overwhelmingly dominated by white men for the vast majority of its existence until the late 20th century.
But the chapter does highlight the progress that has been made, particularly in terms of women's representation in Congress, which has been driven by the women's rights movement and the work of organizations like the National Organization for Women, NOW, and the National Women's Political Caucus, NWPC.
Key organizations.
With key figures like Bella Abzug, Gloria Steinem, and Shirley Chisholm among their founders. The impact of groups like Emily's List, which supports pro-choice Democratic women candidates, and similar efforts by Republicans to recruit more women candidates are also important.
And there has also been notable progress in increasing African-American representation in Congress, marked by the founding of the Congressional Black Caucus, CBC.
The CBC, very influential.
With influential figures like Ralph Metcalfe and, again, Shirley Chisholm among its founding members.
And the chapter points out that the 117th Congress was the most racially and ethnically diverse in U.S. history, with significant numbers of Black and Latino members.
Progress, definitely.
However, it also notes that Congress still does not fully mirror the overall diversity of the U.S. population, particularly in areas like gender and religious affiliation.
Still ways to go in descriptive representation. So, beyond just demographics, how do representatives actually go about representing their constituents on a day-to-day basis once they're in Washington?
A significant part of it involves what's often referred to as bringing home the bacon, or engaging in pork barrel politics.
Ah, the earmarks and projects.
Securing federal funding for specific projects and initiatives within their district or state. While this practice is often criticized as wasteful spending,
Voters tend to like it when it's their district getting the bacon.
True. The chapter also mentions allocation, which involves strategically influencing the national budget in ways that will directly benefit their constituents, such as securing funding for local infrastructure projects or obtaining tax breaks for key industries in their area.
Steering resources home.
However, these kinds of budgetary allocations can often be viewed very differently depending on one's political perspective, as we saw with the intense opposition to the Affordable Care Act, with some critics characterizing its provisions as bribery.
Yeah, one person's necessary funding is another's political payoff.
And sometimes representatives engage in what are essentially symbolic votes, taking stances on issues that they know aren't likely to become law, but which serve to demonstrate to their constituents that they are listening and share their concerns.
Like voting to repeal a law they know won't be repealed.
Exactly, as seen with the repeated Republican-led efforts to repeal the ACA after they gained control of the House in 2010, show the base you're fighting.
It sounds like there's a growing concern among the public about a perceived disconnect between Washington, D.C. and the everyday needs of their communities back home,
The Beltway bubble.
with some representatives even going to the extent of trying to appear more connected by living in their offices in D.C. rather than establishing separate residences there.
Sleeping on the couch in the office to show you're not going Washington.
Something like that. Now, the chapter also discusses the concept of collective representation. This refers to the question of whether Congress, as a whole, effectively represents the diverse interests and viewpoints of the entire U.S. population.
Right, collective representation. It's not just about whether individual members reflect their districts, but whether the entire body of Congress looks and thinks like the country it serves.
Yeah, the big picture view.
And that seems like a much more complex goal to achieve given the wide range of ideologies and interests that exist across the nation.
Precisely. This inherent diversity within the United States, along with the necessary processes of compromise and negotiation that are essential to the functioning of Congress, often contributes to the generally low public approval ratings that Congress tends to receive.
Those approval ratings for Congress are consistently quite low, often hovering below 20% in recent years.
Abysmal sometimes.
Although the chapter notes a slight increase to around 30% in mid-2021, it's quite striking that despite this widespread disapproval of Congress as an institution, the re-election rates for individual incumbents remain remarkably high.
A great paradox. Hate Congress, love my congressperson.
It seems like people often differentiate between their own representative and the broader Congress.
It's a well-documented paradox in American politics. The chapter points to a few specific events that have temporarily boosted congressional approval ratings, such as the surge in national unity after the 9/11 terrorist attacks,
Could rally around the flag effect.
and a lesser peak in 1998. Generally, it seems that congressional approval is often linked to the public's perception of the body's productivity and effectiveness,
Getting things done or looking like they are.
seeming to rise during periods of significant legislative action, such as the initial years of the Obama administration, with the passage of the stimulus package and financial reform legislation, and declining during periods of intense partisan gridlock, such as the debates over the Affordable Care Act.
Gridlock equals low approval.
Seems to be the pattern. Public perception of government deficits also plays a role, often viewed negatively even if economists might see them as a necessary tool during economic downturns, and this concern is frequently used politically,
Oh yeah, deficit hawk arguments.
as seen with criticisms leveled by both Democrats and Republicans at different times.
Okay, so we've explored the who of Congress, who its members are, and who they represent, and the what powers they hold. Now, let's delve into the how Congress actually functions internally, looking at party leadership and the crucial committee system.
Right. Party leadership in Congress plays a crucial role in controlling the flow of legislative action. In both the House and the Senate, each political party has its own caucuses or conferences that meet to elect their leaders.
Democrats have their conference, Republicans have theirs.
Exactly. These include the majority and minority leaders, as well as various whips. It's worth noting that independent members of Congress typically choose to join one of the major party conferences,
I got a caucus with someone usually.
generally. The Speaker of the House is arguably the most powerful individual in the House of Representatives. This position is elected by a vote of the entire House membership and is the only leadership position explicitly mentioned in the Constitution.
Only one in the Constitution. Interesting.
Yes. The Speaker serves not only as the presiding officer, but also as the administrative head of the House, a key partisan leader, and a representative of their own district. They are also second in the line of presidential succession.
Big job. And the chapter details the significant powers that the Speaker wields, from the crucial task of assigning bills to the appropriate committees,
Deciding where a bill starts its journey,
to scheduling votes on the House floor, ruling on procedural matters, appointing members and chairs to committees, creating select committees to address specific issues, and even appointing a Speaker pro tempore to preside in their absence.
lots of levers of power. Below the Speaker, we have the House Majority Leader, who holds considerable power and is often seen as the next in line for the speakership, and the House Minority Leader, who serves as the leader of the opposition party.
And the whips.
Then there are the whips in both parties whose job is to ensure party discipline and to whip up support for key votes.
Counting votes, twisting arms.
Sometimes, yes. The leadership structure in the Senate is a bit different, isn't it? Lacking a position quite as powerful as the Speaker.
Yeah, no single figure quite like the Speaker.
That's correct. The Senate has a majority leader who holds the most power in that chamber, with responsibilities somewhat analogous to the Speaker of the House. There is also a minority leader and whips who serve similar functions to their counterparts in the House.
But the VP is technically President of the Senate.
The Vice President of the United States holds the title of President of the Senate, but only votes in the event of a tie.
Tiebreaker.
Right. The President pro tempore is typically the most senior member of the majority party in the Senate and serves largely in a ceremonial role.
Mostly symbolic.
The real power in the Senate lies with the majority and minority leaders, who must often work together, given the Senate's rules and the need to secure 60 votes to overcome a filibuster on many key legislative actions.
That 60-vote hurdle looms large.
It certainly does. Now, the committee system really seems to be where a significant amount of the detailed legislative work actually takes place in Congress.
The legislative workshops.
Absolutely. The committee system is essential for dividing the vast workload of Congress based on areas of specialization. It's within these committees that most bills are initially considered, debated, and amended, and where a significant amount of agenda setting occurs.
Where the nitty-gritty happens.
You can think of them as being somewhat analogous to the departments within the executive branch. There are over 200 different committees and subcommittees in Congress.
Wow, over 200. That's a lot of specialization.
It is. And the chapter distinguishes between different types of committees, most notably the standing committees, which are the permanent ones, and where the vast majority of proposed legislation ends up.
Like Ways and Means or Judiciary.
Exactly. The chapter gives some examples. It's often said that most bills actually die in committee, right?
Yeah, the committee graveyard.
That's a very accurate statement. The chapter outlines the typical process within a standing committee, holding hearings to gather information from experts and stakeholders.
Bringing in the experts.
The process of amending and voting on the bill, known as the markup session.
Markup, where they really hash it out.
And then the creation of a committee report, which includes the majority and minority views on the legislation, as well as an analysis of its potential costs and impacts. Senate committees also play a crucial role in holding confirmation hearings for presidential appointments.
Supreme Court nominees, cabinet secretaries.
Exactly. That's a key Senate committee function.
And beyond the standing committees, there are other types, like joint committees that have members from both the House and the Senate, often for informational purposes.
Like the Joint Economic Committee.
Conference committees that are formed to reconcile the different versions of a bill that have passed each chamber.
To iron out the differences. Crucial steps sometimes.
Though the chapter notes that sometimes this step is skipped, as was the case with the House deferring to the Senate's version of the ACA.
Right. They can just agree to one chamber's version.
And then there are select or ad hoc or special committees, which are usually temporary bodies created to address specific issues, like the House Select Committee on Benghazi,
Which can sometimes get very political.
which the chapter highlights as an example of how these can become quite partisan.
Members of Congress often seek assignments to specific committees based on their background, experience, and interests.
You want to be on agriculture if you're from Iowa, maybe.
Makes sense. The party leadership plays a significant role in selecting committee chairs, and these chairs wield considerable power within their committees.
The chair holds the gavel, holds the power.
Controlling things like the committee's budget, setting the schedule for meetings and hearings, and importantly, deciding whether or not a particular bill will even be considered by the committee.
They can just kill a bill by ignoring it.
Absolutely. The chapter mentions that there are term limits for committee chairs in both the House and the Senate. The example of Senate Judiciary Committee Chair Chuck Grassley's role in blocking the nomination of Merrick Garland provides a clear illustration of the power a committee chair can hold.
A very stark example of that power.
The chapter also points out some key differences between House and Senate committees, noting that because the Senate has fewer members overall, individual senators tend to have more committee assignments than their House counterparts.
Spread thinner in the Senate.
Right. Historically, the House has also tended to defer more to the decisions made by its committees compared to the Senate.
Okay, so let's say a bill manages to navigate this complex gauntlet of committees. What happens next in the classic version of the legislative process?
In the classic process, first, a bill is drafted. which can actually be done by anyone, a lobbyist, an interest group, even a private citizen.
Anyone can write one.
But only a member of Congress can officially introduce it in either the House or the Senate.
Needs a sponsor.
Exactly. The chapter reminds us that bills that are primarily intended to raise revenue, like tax bills, must originate in the House of Representatives, according to Article 1, Section 7 of the Constitution.
Power of the purse starts in the House.
Though Congress has developed ways to work around this requirement in practice, once introduced, the bill is referred to the relevant committee. The majority leadership in each chamber usually consults with the parliamentarian,
The rules guru.
who is an expert on the rules of that chamber, to determine which committee is the most appropriate to handle the bill. The chair of that committee then controls the initial stages of the process.
Back to the chair's power.
Right. If the committee decides to take action on the bill, it will typically hold hearings to gather testimony and information from experts, agency officials, the bill's sponsors, lobbyists, and academics.
Get input.
Following the hearings, the committee will often hold a markup session where members can propose amendments to the bill and then vote on whether to approve it.
The real debate and changes happen here.
Often, if a motion to table the bill is successful, it usually means the bill is effectively dead in that committee.
Tabled means shelved.
Pretty much. If the bill is approved by the committee, it then moves to the floor for consideration by the full House or Senate. In the House, the bill goes to the House Committee on Rules,
The powerful Rules Committee.
which sets the rules for debate on the floor, including time limits and whether amendments can be offered.
Controls how the debate will happen.
Exactly. The bill is then debated and can be further amended on the floor, and finally, a simple majority vote is needed for it to pass the House. In the Senate, once a bill is reported out of committee, it is placed on the Senate calendar. Debate rules in the Senate are generally more flexible than in the House,
Famously more flexible.
with no strict time limits on how long a senator can speak unless agreed upon by unanimous consent or through a motion. This brings us to the infamous filibuster.
The filibuster, that's the tactic of using lengthy speeches to try and delay or block a vote on a bill or other measure.
That's the one. The chapter notes that it really became a prominent tactic during the debates over slavery in the 19th century.
A long and controversial history.
And now we have the process of cloture, which is a way to end a filibuster, but it requires a supermajority vote. Initially, 2/3 of the Senate, but now typically 3/5 or 60 votes.
60 votes needed to break it.
Except in the case of judicial nominations where only a simple majority is needed, and filibusters are not allowed on budget reconciliation bills.
Some exceptions.
Right. The chapter mentions Strom Thurmond's record-setting filibuster, and the more recent example of Senator Ted Cruz's 2013 filibuster, where he read from Green Eggs and Ham.
That got a lot of attention.
And the chapter points out that in the modern Senate, often just the threat of a filibuster is enough to require 60 votes to move forward on many issues.
The silent filibuster. Just signal the intent.
Exactly. And then there's the budget reconciliation process, which, as we touched on earlier, is a special legislative procedure that can be used for certain budget-related legislation and allows it to bypass the filibuster in the Senate, requiring only a simple majority of 51 votes to pass.
The filibuster workaround for budget stuff?
Essentially. This process has been used for significant pieces of legislation, like parts of the Affordable Care Act, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, and the American Rescue Plan.
Big laws passed this way.
If the House and the Senate pass different versions of the same bill, one chamber can choose to simply accept the other's version. Or the first chamber can propose amendments to the second's version and send it back. If they can't reach an agreement through this process, the bill typically goes to a conference committee,
Back to conference committee.
made up of members from both the House and the Senate, to try and iron out the differences and create a single compromise version. Once a final version is agreed upon by the conference committee, or if the chambers agree to identical versions, the bill is then sent to the president for their action.
Off to the White House.
The president can either sign the bill into law or veto it. If the president vetoes a bill, Congress has the power to override that veto with a 2/3 vote in both the House and the Senate.
High bar for an override.
Very high.
That certainly sounds like a very long and often complicated journey for a bill to become a law. But the chapter also makes the point that modern legislation frequently takes a different, more unorthodox route. What are some of the key ways the process has changed?
Well, the budget reforms of the 1970s were a major catalyst for these changes. The 1974 Budget and Impoundment Control Act, in particular, provided a framework for these large, comprehensive budget decisions.
Setting up the budget process we kind of know now.
Right. The use of the budget process as a vehicle for broader policy changes really gained momentum in the 1980s with the increasing use of omnibus bills.
The giant 1,000-page bills.
Massive legislative packages that combine many different policy proposals into a single bill that is then voted on as a whole. This can speed up the process of enacting multiple policies at once, but also concentrates a great deal of power in the hands of party leadership.
Less scrutiny on individual parts sometimes.
That's a criticism. It became a common way of addressing complex policy challenges in the 1990s. The chapter also highlights the increased power of party leadership in this modern legislative process, largely driven by the heightened levels of partisanship we've seen since the 1980s.
Leadership calls the shots more often.
Leadership in the House, in particular, often uses special rules to control the outcomes of votes and to restrict debate on the floor. The increased practice of multiple referrals, where different parts of a bill are sent to several different committees simultaneously, also weakens the traditional role of committee specialization and increases the reliance on guidance and direction from party leadership.
Undermining the committees a bit?
Some argue that. In some cases, leadership may even bypass the traditional committee process altogether.
Straight to the floor.
It can happen. And in the Senate, the modern use of the filibuster, where a motion for cloture is often requested before a vote can even take place, effectively sets a 60-vote threshold for advancing many pieces of legislation, giving the minority party significant power to obstruct the majority's agenda.
That 60-vote requirement really shapes everything.
It's a far cry from the idealized version of how a bill becomes law that many people learn in civics classes.
Schoolhouse rock it is not, always.
Not always, no.
Well, this has truly been a deep dive into the intricate workings of the U.S. Congress. We've covered a vast amount of ground, from its foundational design and the sometimes messy reality of congressional elections, to the complexities of representation and the evolving nature of the legislative process itself.
And hopefully for you, our listener, this exploration has provided a clearer and more insightful framework for understanding Congress that goes beyond the often superficial headlines we encounter.
Yeah, hopefully a bit more context.
It is without a doubt a complex institution, but it remains absolutely vital to the functioning of our republic.
So as a final thought to leave you with, consider this. With all the historical shifts and the ongoing power struggles between Congress and the other branches of government, is the current design and operation of Congress truly serving the needs of the Republic as the framers originally intended?
A big question.
What are the potential implications for the future of American governance, and what kinds of debates and potential reforms related to Congress might we see emerge in the years ahead? It's certainly something to keep in mind and to continue exploring on your own.